Tamar the Great reigned as king of Georgia from 1184 to 1213, presiding over the apex of the Georgian Golden Age. A member of the Bagrationi dynasty, her position as the first woman to rule Georgia in her own right was emphasized by the title mep'e, commonly afforded to Tamar in the medieval Georgian sources. Tamar was proclaimed heir and co-ruler by her reigning father George III in 1178. But she faced significant opposition from the aristocracy upon her ascension to full ruling powers after George's death. Tamar was successful in neutralizing this opposition and embarked on an energetic foreign policy aided by the decline of the hostile Seljuq Turks. Relying on a powerful military ally, Tamar was able to build on the successes of her predecessors to consolidate an empire which dominated the Caucasus until its collapse under the Mongol attacks within 2 decades after Tamar's death. Tamar was married twice, her first union being, from 1185 to 1187, to the Rus Prince Yuri, whom she divorced and expelled from the country, defeating his subsequent coup attempts. For her second consort Tamar chose, in 1191, the Alan Prince David Soslan, by whom she had 2 children, George and Rusudan, the 2 successive monarchs on the throne of Georgia. Tamar's association with the period of political and military successes and cultural achievements, combined with her role as a female ruler, has led to her idealization and romanticization in Georgian arts and historical memory. She remains an important symbol in Georgian popular culture and has been canonized by the Georgian Orthodox Church as the Holy Righteous King Tamar, with her feast day commemorated on the 14th of May. Early life and ascent to the throne. Tamar was born in circa 1160 to George III, King of Georgia, and his consort Bagrationi, a daughter of the King of Alania. While it is possible that Tamar had a younger sister, Rusudan, she is only mentioned once in all contemporary accounts of Tamar's reign. The name Tamar is of Hebrew origin and, like other biblical names, was favored by the Georgian Bagrationi dynasty because of the claim to be descended from David, the second king of Israel. Tamar's youth coincided with a major upheaval in Georgia. In 1177, her father George III was confronted by a rebellious faction of nobles. The rebels intended to dethrone George in favor of the king's fraternal nephew, Demna, who was considered by many to be a legitimate royal heir of his murdered father, David V. Demna's cause was little but a pretext for the nobles, led by the pretender's father-in-law, the emir Spassaler of Van Orbeli, to weaken the crown. George III was able to crush the revolt and embarked on a crackdown campaign on the defiant aristocratic clans of Van Orbeli was put to death and the surviving members of his family were driven out of Georgia. Prince Demna, castrated and blinded on his uncle's order, did not survive the mutilation and soon died in prison. Once the rebellion was suppressed and the pretender eliminated, George went ahead to co-opt Tamar into government with him and crowned her as co-ruler in 1178. By doing so, the king attempted to preempt any dispute after his death and legitimize his line on the throne of Georgia. At the same time, he raised men from the gentry and unranked classes to keep the dynastic aristocracy away from the center of power. Early reign and the first marriage. For 6 years, Tamar was a co-ruler with her father, upon whose death, in 1184, Tamar continued as the sole monarch and was crowned a second time at the Gelati Cathedral near Kuisi, western Georgia. She inherited a relatively strong kingdom, but the centrifugal tendencies fostered by the great nobles were far from being quelled. There was considerable opposition to Tamar's succession succession. This was sparked by a reaction against the repressive policies of her father and encouraged by the new sovereign's other perceived weakness, her sex. As Georgia had never previously had a female ruler, a part of the aristocracy questioned Tamar's legitimacy, while others tried to exploit her youth and supposed weakness to assert greater autonomy for themselves. The energetic involvement of Tamar's influential aunt Rasudan and the Georgian Catholicos patriarch Michael IV Myriones was crucial for legitimizing Tamar's succession to the throne. However, the young queen was forced into making significant concessions to the aristocracy. She had to reward the Catholicos patriarch Michael's support by making him a chancellor, thus placing him at the top of both the clerical and secular hierarchies. Tamar was also pressured into dismissing her father's appointees, among them the constable Kubazar, a Georgian Kipchak of ignoble birth, who had helped George III in his crackdown on the defiant nobility. One of the few entitled servitors of George III to escape this fate was the treasurer Quilu Arslan, who now led a group of nobles and wealthy citizens in a struggle to limit the royal authority by creating a new council, Kiravi, whose members would alone deliberate and decide policy. This attempt at feudal constitutionalism was rendered abortive when Tamar had Quilu Arslan arrested and his supporters were inveigled into submission. Yet Tamar's first moves to reduce the power of the aristocratic elite were unsuccessful. She failed in her attempt to use a church synod to dismiss the Catholicos patriarch Michael, and the noble council, Darbazi, asserted the right to approve royal decrees. Even the queen's first husband, the Rus Prince Uri, was forced on her by the nobles, pursuant to dynastic imperatives and the ethos of the time. The nobles required Tamar to marry in order to have a leader for the army and to provide an heir to the throne. The choice fell on Uri, son of the murdered Prince Andrei I Bogolubsky of Vladimir Suzdal, who then lived as a refugee among the Kipchaks of the North Caucasus. The choice was approved by Tamar's aunt Rasudan, and the prince was brought to Georgia to marry the queen in 1185. Uri proved to be an able soldier, but a difficult person, and he soon ran afoul of his wife. The strained spousal relations paralleled a factional struggle at the royal court in which Tamar was becoming more and more assertive of her rights as a queen regnant. The turning point in Tamar's fortunes came with the death of the powerful Catholicos patriarch Michael, whom the queen replaced as a chancellor, with her supporter Anton Olistavizadze. Tamar gradually expanded her own power base and elevated her loyal nobles to high positions at the court, most notably the Zakarids Makagzali. Second marriage. In 1187, Tamar persuaded the noble council to approve her to divorce Uri, who was accused of addiction to drunkenness and sodomy, and was sent off to Constantinople. Assisted by several Georgian aristocrats anxious to check Tamar's growing power, Uri made 2 coup attempts, but failed and went off to obscurity after 1191. The queen chose her second husband herself. He was David Soslan, an Alan prince, to whom the 18th-century Georgian scholar Prince Vakashti ascribes descent from the early 11th-century Georgian King George I. David, a capable military commander, became Tamar's major supporter and was instrumental in defeating the rebellious nobles who rallied behind Uri. Tamar and David had 2 children. In 1192 or 1194, the queen gave birth to a son, George Lasha, the future King George IV. The daughter, Rasudan, was born c. 1195 and would succeed her brother as a sovereign of Georgia. David Soslan's status of a king consort, as well as his presence in art, on charters, and on coins, was dictated by the necessity of male aspects of kingship. but he remained a subordinate ruler who shared the throne with and derived his power from Tamar. Tamar continued to be styled as mep'e, king of kings. In Georgian, a language with no grammatical genders, mep does not necessarily imply a masculine connotation and can be rendered as a sovereign. The female equivalent of mep is death.Tamar, which was applied to queens consort of the king's closest, senior female relatives. Tamar is occasionally called death.Tamar in the Georgian chronicles and on some charters. Thus, the title of mep might have been applied to Tamar to mark out her unique position among women. Foreign policy and military campaigns. Muslim neighbors. Once Tamar succeeded in consolidating her power and found a reliable support in David Soslan, the Zacharit Makargzali, Torelli, and other noble families. She revived the expansionist foreign policy of her predecessors. Repeated occasions of dynastic strife in Georgia combined with the efforts of regional successors of the Great Seljuq Empire, such as the Ilknizar Begs of Azerbaijan, Shirvanshahs, and the Alashas, had slowed down the dynamic of the Georgians achieved during the reigns of Tamar's great-grandfather David IV and her father George III. However, the Georgians became again active under Tamar, more prominently in the second decade of her rule. Early in the 1190s, the Georgian government began to interfere in the affairs of the Ilknizars and of the Shirvanshahs, aiding rivaling local princes and reducing Shirvan to a tributary state. The Ilknizar Beg Abu Bakr attempted to stem the Georgian advance, but suffered a defeat at the hands of David Soslan at the Battle of Shamkor and lost his capital to a Georgian protege in 1195. Although Abu Bakr was able to resume his reign a year later, the Ilknizars were only barely able to contain further Georgian forays. In 1199, Tamar's armies led by two Christianized Kurdish generals, Zakhair and Ivan Zacharid Makargzali, dislodged the Shaddadi dynasty from Ani, the erstwhile capital of the Armenian kingdom, and received it from the queen as the fief. For the base at Ani, the brothers surged ahead into the central Armenian lands, reclaiming one after another fortresses and districts from a local Muslim rulers. Bjni was taken in 1201 and Dvin fell in 1203. Alarmed by the Georgian successors, Suleiman Shah II, the resurgent Seljuqid Sultan of Rum, rallied his vassal emirs and marched against Georgia, but his camp was attacked and destroyed by David Soslan at the Battle of Bajan in 1203 or 1204. The chronicler of Tamar describes how the army was assembled at the rock-hewn town of Vardzia before marching on to Bajan, and how the queen addressed the troops from the balcony of the church. The Zakharit Makargzali captured Kars on behalf of the Georgian crown in 1206, but were repelled from the walls of Aklat in 1209. This brought the struggle for the Armenian lands to a stall, leaving the Lake Van region in a relatively secure possession of its new masters, the Ayyubids of Damascus. In 1209, the brothers Zakharids Makargzali laid waste to Ardabil, according to the Georgian and Armenian annals, as a revenge for the local Muslim rulers' attack on Ani and his massacre of the city's Christian population. In a great final burst, the brothers led an army marshaled throughout Tamar's possessions and vassal territories in a march through Nakhchivan and Julfa, Tamarant, Tabriz, and Karsvan in northwest Iran, pillaging several settlements on the way. Trebizond and the Middle East. Among the remarkable events of Tamar's reign was the foundation of the Empire of Trebizond on the Black Sea coast in 1204. This state was established by Alexios I Megaskomnenos and his brother, David, in the northeastern Pontic provinces of the crumbling Byzantine Empire with the aid of Georgian troops. Alexios and David, Tamar's relatives, were fugitive Byzantine princes raised at the Georgian court. According to Tamar's historian, the aim of the Georgian expedition to Trebizond was to punish the Byzantine Emperor Alexios IV Angelos for his confiscation of a shipment of money for the Georgian queen to the monasteries of Antioch and Mount Athos. However, Tamar's Pontic endeavor can better be explained by her desire to take advantage of the Western European Fourth Crusade against Constantinople to set up a friendly state in Georgia's immediate southwestern neighborhood, as well as by the dynastic solidarity to the dispossessed Komnenoi. Tamar sought to make use of the weakness of the Byzantine Empire and the Crusaders' defeat at the hands of the Ayyubid Sultan Saladin in order to gain Georgia's position on the international stage and to assume the traditional role of the Byzantine crown as a protector of the Christians of the Middle East. Christian Georgian missionaries were active in the North Caucasus and the expatriate monastic communities were scattered throughout the eastern Mediterranean. Tamar's chronicle praises her universal protection of Christianity and her support of churches and monasteries from Egypt to Bulgaria and Cyprus. The Georgian court was primarily concerned with the protection of the Georgian monastic centers in the Holy Land. By the 12th century, 8 Georgian monasteries were listed in Jerusalem. Saladin's biographer Baha ad-Din ibn Sadat reports that after the Ayyubid conquest of Jerusalem in 1187, Tamar sent envoys to the Sultan to request that the confiscated possessions of the Georgian monasteries in Jerusalem be returned. Saladin's response is not recorded, but the queen's efforts seem to have been successful. Jagdavitri, who retained to the bishopric of Acre shortly after Tamar's death, gives further evidence of the Georgians' presence in Jerusalem. He writes that the Georgians were, in contrast to the other Christian pilgrims, allowed a free passage into the city with the banners unfurled. Ibn Sadat furthermore claims that Tamar outbid the Byzantine emperor in her efforts to obtain the relics of the true cross, offering 200,000 gold pieces to Saladin, who had taken the relics as booty at the Battle of Hattin, to no avail. However, Golden Age, feudal monarchy Georgia's political and cultural exploits of Tamar's epoch were rooted in a long and complex past. Tamar owed her accomplishments most immediately to the reforms of her great-grandfather David IV and, more remotely, to the unifying efforts of David III and Bagrat III, who became architects of a political unity of Georgian kingdoms and principalities in the opening decade of the 11th century. Tamar was able to build upon the successes. By the last years of Tamar's reign, the Georgian state had reached the zenith of its power and prestige in the Middle Ages. Tamar's realm stretched from the Greater Caucasus crest in the north to Erzurum in the south, and from the Zigi in the northwest to the vicinity of Ganja in the southeast, forming a pan-Caucasian empire, with the loyal Zachariad regime in northern and central Armenia, Shirvan as a vassal and Trebizond as an ally. A contemporary Georgian historian extols Tamar as the master of the lands from the Sea of Pontus to the Sea of Gurgen, from Speri to Debend, and all the hither and the thither Caucasus up to Khazaria and Scythia. The royal title was correspondingly aggrandized. It now reflected not only Tamar's sway over the traditional subdivisions of the Georgian realm, but also included new components, emphasizing the Georgian crown's hegemony over the neighboring lands. Thus, on the coins and charters issued in her name, Tamar is identified as the queen. Never achieved autocratic powers and the noble council continued to function. However, Tamar's own prestige and the expansion of Patron Kimoba, a Georgian version of feudalism, kept the more powerful dynastic princes from fragmenting. the kingdom. This was a classical period in the history of Georgian feudalism. Attempts at transplanting feudal practices in the areas where they had previously been almost unknown did not pass without resistance. Thus, there was a revolt among the mountaineers of Parkovy and Dido on Georgia's northeastern frontier in 1212, which was put down by Ivan Zacharid-Makargzeli after 3 months of heavy fighting. With flourishing commercial centers now under Georgia's control, industry and commerce brought new wealth to the country and the court. Tribute extracted from the neighbors and war booty added to the royal treasury, giving rise to the saying that the peasants were like nobles, the nobles like princes, and the princes like kings. Culture. With this prosperity came an outburst of the distinct Georgian culture emerging from the amalgam of Christianity, secularism, as well as Western and Eastern influences. Despite this, the Georgians continued to identify with the Byzantine West rather than Islamic East, with the Georgian monarchy seeking to underscore its association with Christianity and present its position as God-given. It was in that period that the canon of Georgian Orthodox architecture was redesigned and a series of large-scale domed cathedrals were built. The Byzantine-derived expression of royal power was modified in various ways to bolster Tamar's unprecedented position as a woman ruling in her own right. The 5 extant monumental church portraits of the queen are clearly modeled on Byzantine imagery, but also highlight specifically Georgian themes and Persian-type ideals of female beauty. Despite Georgia's Byzantine-leaning culture, the country's intimate trade connections with the Middle East is evidenced on contemporary Georgian coinage, whose legends were composed in Georgian and Arabic. A series of coins minted in circa 1200 in the name of Queen Tamar depicted a local variant of the Byzantine obverse and an Arabic inscription on the reverse proclaiming Tamar as the champion of the Messiah. The contemporary Georgian chronicles enshrined Christian morality and patristic literature continued to flourish, but it had, by that time, lost its earlier dominant position to secular literature, which was highly original, even though it developed close contact with neighboring cultures. The trend culminated in Shota Rustaveli's epic poem The Knight in the Panther's Skin, which celebrates the ideals of an age of chivalry and is revered in Georgia as the greatest achievement of native literature. Death and burial. Tamar outlived her consort, David Soslan, and died of a devastating disease not far from her capital Tbilisi, having previously crowned her son, Georgi Lasha, co-regent. Tamar's historian relates that the queen suddenly fell ill when discussing state affairs with her ministers at the Nacharmagevi castle near the town of Gori. She was transported to Tbilisi and then to the nearby castle of Bagrationi, where Tamar died and was mourned by her subjects. Her remains were transferred to the cathedral of Mtskata and then to the Gelati monastery, a family burial ground of the Georgian royal dynasty. The traditional scholarly opinion is that Tamar died in 1213, although there are several indications that she might have died earlier, in 1207 or 1210. In later times, a number of legends emerged about Tamar's place of burial. One of them has it that Tamar was buried in a secret niche at the Gelati monastery so as to prevent the grave from being profaned by her enemies. Another version suggests that Tamar's remains were reburied in a remote location, possibly in the Holy Land. The French knight Guillaume de Bois, in a letter dated from the early 13th century, written in Palestine and addressed to the Bishop of Besançon, claimed that he had heard that the king of the Georgians Turks was heading towards Jerusalem with a huge army and had already conquered many cities of the Saracens. He was carrying, the report said, the remains of his mother, the powerful Queen Tamar, who had been unable to make a pilgrimage to the Holy Land in her lifetime and had bequeathed her body to be buried near the Holy Sepulchre. In the 20th century, the quest for Tamar's grave became a subject of scholarly research, as well as the focus of broader public interest. The Georgian writer Grigol Robichaudze wrote in his 1918 essay on Tamar, "Thus far, nobody knows where Tamar's grave is. She belongs to everyone and to no one. Her grave is in the heart of the Georgian, and in the Georgian's perception, this is not a grave, but a beautiful vase in which an unfading flower, the great Tamar, flourishes." An orthodox academic view still places Tamar's grave at Gelati, but a series of archaeological studies, beginning with Tagarashvili in 1920, has failed to locate it at the monastery.